Here we are then, welcome to the glamorous Millbrook high-speed bowl and welcome to the interior of the Polestar 2. This is a 4-door fastback saloon. It's a little bit shorter than a BMW 3 Series, but also taller, higher roofline, and it feels that way from inside the car. You sort of sit enveloped in this high belt line, and so in one sense you feel quite low, but you're also sitting sort of medium high, somewhere between saloon level and sort of crossover SUV level, and you've got a slightly raised vantage point. So the visibility forward is very good. Right then, a quick summary of the technical makeup of this car before we get on to describing the driving experience. This car is based on Volvo's CMA platform, which is the same one as is used by the XC40. I suppose technically that means it's not a ground-up, clean-sheet EV platform, although maybe Volvo/Polestar would debate that, and I'm sure others would too. For power, this car has one electric motor for each axle, and they make a combined 400 horsepower for it and just under 500 pounds-foot of torque. So that's plenty. It'll do 62 miles an hour from standing in less than 5 seconds. And then in terms of battery capacity, there's a 78 kilowatt hour lithium-ion battery sort of packaged underneath across the back seats and in the transmission tunnel. And so that's a little tiny bit more, funnily enough, than you get in the top of the range Model 3. Funny that. The car's underbody is steel. This is a steel car, like a Model 3 is a steel car, and most saloons of this size and price are steel, but it's quite heavy. So while a Model 3 goes from about sort of 1,700 to 1,850 kilos at the curb, this thing weighs more than 2.1 tons. It's quite a lot for a car of its size. It's interesting that. I wonder if they did that because it's safer to make it heavier, because the batteries have got more crash safety engineered into them. You know, it's difficult to say, but it's certainly a heavy car, this, but it's not a slow one. So 60 from rest takes less than 5 seconds and it'll do nearly 130 miles an hour. Not slow at all. So what's it like inside? Well, the driving environment is quite nice, actually. The funny thing about this car was they launched it as having the first vegan interior in production. You might remember that. You don't eat it, just to be clear. Most of the sort of major mouldings are made of a mix of plastic, recycled plastic, and they use recycled fishing nets for the floor mats, and it's all very clever. It's all very woke and sustainable. But, you know, it's going to be a selling point for the car in these times, isn't it? You know, people like the idea of a really sustainable car. And the thing is, these mouldings, this interior, doesn't let the car down at all for sort of perceived quality. You feel quite low and enveloped in this car. You feel quite nicely cocooned. There's a slightly limited amount of space. I mean, I suppose I'm pretty big. I could do with another inch of headroom here. The panoramic roof is just leaving the header rail a little bit close there. I'm out of headroom if I sit in the back. I'm really not struggling, but I wouldn't want to be there for much longer than sort of 20 minutes. Equally, there's a lot of cars of this size that I wouldn't want to sit in the back of, and if you're just putting the kids back there, they would be fine. Up front, you get this big portrait-oriented touchscreen infotainment system, which is not unlike the one you get on a Tesla. Not by chance, I suspect, but this one is designed to look and feel very much just like a big Android smartphone, and so it might be, you know, quite intuitive to use if you've already got one of those. It works via Google Apps, so the sat nav is a Google Apps based sat nav, and you can get Spotify just like you would on your phone. It's all quite intuitive. It's all quite familiar. It works. They say CarPlay functionality is going to come along next year, and presumably via an over-the-air software update. So here we are, we're sat at 65 miles an hour. How's the refinement? It's pretty good. I mean, you might sense I'm raising my voice a little bit more than you might expect. This is a performance pack car, so it's got optional stuff on it which might adversely affect the refinement a bit. It's got 20-inch wheels, it's got lowered, stiffered suspension springs, it's got expensive Öhlins dampers, and I sense they do sacrifice a bit of cabin isolation for that extra sort of performance feel that they deliver. The ride is a little bit noisy perhaps. It's also firm, but the dampers are adjustable. This is the standard setting, and I would definitely want to soften it off a little bit in order to get that kind of fluent ride, that effortless feel that I think you want in an EV. Polestar have gone for a slightly firmer ride to this car in order that people who spend the £5 grand on the performance pack feel a benefit. And until I can actually drive one, having configured it to my liking, I'm a little bit reluctant to say much about how it rides. As standard, it's a little bit firm. We'll leave it at that for now. If you don't have the performance pack, it could ride just fine, this car. It's certainly not far away from being pretty comfortable. It's also a very drivable thing, very easy to drive. I mean, we're sat here, we're in lane 1, 2, 3, 4 of a 5-lane bowl, which is not unlike a sort of a big motorway. If I set the pilot assist system to 70 miles an hour, it's easy. It's keeping itself in the lane, it's regulating the distance to the car ahead. I've got one hand on the wheel because that's the way it works. And the point is, this isn't a Tesla autopilot system, and it really isn't trying to be. So it wants to keep you engaged in the driving experience. It's not wrestling with you for that fine control over the car's positioning in the lane. It's working to help you. And if you take your hand off the wheel for very long, as I just have, before very long, it will just beep at me and tell me to put it back. Where are we now? 10 seconds, maybe. There we go. Apply steering. So we'll just pop the one hand back on. Very easy to drive indeed. Range is probably the last thing we should touch on before we move on. The official range claim for this car is around 300 miles. A little bit more if you have the standard one with the 19s and the Primacy economy tyres. A little bit less than 300 if you have this one on the 20s with the Continental sports tyres. I drove it a bit last night and on my way here to Millbrook this morning, and I would be surprised if you actually got 300 miles out of this car in the real world. I reckon you probably end up getting somewhere between 200 and 220, 230, depending on how you drive and where you drive. And that's probably a little bit less than you'd get with an equivalent Model 3. And there are one or two other EVs that go further. So maybe range isn't as good as it could be in this car. Maybe that's where the high, the kind of high profile of the car, the frontal area, that mass we were talking about earlier, that 2 tons of mass, maybe that's all playing against it a little bit. The good news is there's only one specification really mechanically that you can get. There's no cheaper, smaller battery, less powerful version of this car that you might end up buying by mistake, and it doesn't do the 300 miles. This is a really simple car in that respect. And I dare say if you kept your speed down around town, it probably would do 300 miles. I mean, it's just when you get out of town and you use it on the motorway and things, I think you'd be lucky to get much more than maybe 220. It's early days, we'll see. Next up, we'll head to the hill route and talk about other stuff. Right then, here we go onto the famous Millbrook Alpine hill route. You may remember this place from Autocar videos of old. We're just going to have a little bit of a exercise of this car. We're going to lean on it a bit and encourage it a bit and carry a bit of speed and see what it's like as a driver's car. I don't think you would realistically want this car to be much quicker than it is. It's got all the power it needs for road driving. Is it fun? I'm not sure. You sort of turn it into a corner and you expect it to roll a bit and to need a minute to just settle on its springs because of how much it weighs and because it's that little bit higher off the ground, but it doesn't. It rolls a little bit, but hardly at all, and it grips really well, really quite evenly, really quite strongly. You can drive it through, keep accelerating out the corners, and the torque distribution feels really well judged actually. It's precise rather than playful. It's not a car you can chuck around or skid about to your heart's content, but it is sort of quietly involving, and it's certainly very fast. It is a kind of a sort of a driver's car, albeit a strange one. It's enjoyable. I think that's about as far as I'll go for now. But yeah, it's interesting. So there you go. One of the best new EVs on the market isn't perhaps the easiest to understand, but then maybe that's a good thing if it makes the Polestar 2 feel so fresh and different. Different from a Volvo, different from a Tesla, and just possibly like the kind of car that could tempt you into your very first EV. Stay tuned for more on this car over the coming months, and if you like this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.